Hello and welcome to Deep Noetics. Today we're going to talk about empire and imperialism. We will be looking at the development of global empire, beginning with the British and transforming in what we have today with the global American empire. I'll be reading from my Substack article titled Colonial Habits and Imperial Vices: Understanding the Inherent Contradictory Nature of Global Politics. What if I told you that the biggest problem with political ideologies was that they are too logical, too consistent? Whenever we educate ourselves about our economies and political systems, we like to find neat theories that allow us to explain all that happens and provide us with a prescription about how to move forward. How come then do we find a multitude of theories, all formally consistent, so radically contradicting each other? Take, for example, the Austrian School of Economics, a school of thought that has served as the basis for libertarian political theory and generally rejects state intervention in the economy. Their theories reduce economies to the most basic principles of human action and derive patterns of economic development from them. Specifically, the business cycle, the interplay of boom and bust, is well explained by the idea that excessive state backed expansion of the money supply results in an artificial bloating of the economy. The correction of this bloat, the bursting of the bubble, is what leads to the recurring crashes or crises of capital. This is pretty consistent with our observation of markets, especially since central banking has allowed states to rapidly increase the money supply at will. Does this lead us to conclude that opposing theories such as socialist economics must therefore be contradictory and wrong? Do all of the intelligent and educated followers of Marxist economics simply not recognize their own error? On the contrary, I would argue that both theories are internally consistent, but derive their claims from different first principles. These first principles necessarily represent radical simplifications or reductions of the complexity of human society, and hence must exclude certain key truths. In other words, libertarians and socialist theories have different blind spots when it comes to accurately describing the political economy. The inherent inadequacy of scientific theories is not a solvable problem, as it stems from the fundamental chaotic nature of our social systems. Human interactions in a market involve unquantifiable interactions and back reactions that no supercomputer on this planet would be able to process. There are simply too many compounding layers of interactions happening simultaneously. Libertarians famously acknowledge this fact about the inherent impossibility to control and direct markets, and conclude from this that state intervention must therefore always be misguided. I'm speaking here of radical libertarians, obviously, or like anarcho capitalists. Obviously, there are libertarians with nuanced positions on this. I'm not trying to strawman here. However, what they so begrudgingly admit is the fact that the state has always been there and will always need to function as the guarantor of functioning contracts and market operation. Except anarcho capitalists, but this is not an article about parody ideologies, I guess. Despite the libertarians' insistence on limiting the extent of state intervention to a minimum, they keep having to witness the state machinery expanding with barely any exceptions. Libertarians explain this continuous growth of the state apparatus by their model of a spiral of intervention, where each state intervention necessitates further ones down the line. Quoting here from Ludwig von Mises' Planned Chaos, Ludwig von Mises is often seen as kind of one of the major pioneers of libertarian theory, libertarian thought. He famously wrote Human Action, a massive work detailing his fundamental libertarian worldview. It's kind of like Das Kapital, the Kapital from Karl Marx. Libertarians have turned themselves into spectators of this perpetual growth of the state, unable to make any prescriptions other than categorically opposing this expansion. Interestingly enough, this is the point where socialist theorists have been witnessing the exact same phenomenon, but explain it in their own terms. So, what I'm basically saying is it's not like one of the theories is right and the other one is wrong. They begin with different first principles, both of which have a legitimacy that are observable in our reality. They are real phenomena. For example, class distinction, which socialist theories are derived from, and at the same time the individual rationality, rational action, which libertarian theories are derived from. And so they describe the historical development of the state in a way that is, in a weird sense, complementary. They don't actually contradict each other. They just kind of use different terms to describe the same phenomenon. And this phenomenon is the growth of the state. So there's kind of this bug in the system, this blind spot, where the state, in socialism, the state becomes the ultimate capitalist. It becomes its negation, it contradicts itself. And in libertarianism, it's like the state is the ultimate company. It is kind of a monopoly arising in a market where people demand and request a monopoly of violence, because anything but a monopoly of violence ensures security and safety and the enforcing of contracts, the very basis of a functioning market. To exemplify what I've been saying, I'm quoting Friedrich Engels here in his essay on socialism, utopian and scientific. The modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to the taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist, the more citizens does it exploit. For a socialist, the state is inextricably linked to the economy, as it is the entity ensuring the continued operation of markets. This role of the state does not merely limit itself to enforcing contracts, but it involves the state actively intervening in order to rescue key industries that the overall economy relies upon. Moreover, the investment into infrastructure and education, especially in a phase of early market development, can yield an overall profit for the state in the form of tax revenue. Just as historically state authority was the main issuer of currency, we now observe the state running the monetary system for an economy that is increasingly sustained by government services. This is where both libertarian and socialist theories arrive at an impasse. Both of them predict and observe the same phenomenon of a continued growth and intertwinement of the state and overall economy. However, the former want to reverse this development, and the latter seek to exacerbate it and capture the state and steer it to serve workers' interests. The core message of both theories is consistent. However, the contradiction appears as soon as it comes to their respective practical implications. The core incoherence comes to the fore as an expression of the inherent opposition between theory and practice. Interestingly enough, Marxists deeply engaged in Marx's work on dialectical materialism and his studies of Hegel were somewhat aware of the contradictory nature of their endeavor. They understood history as a dialectic, meaning a perpetual resolution of contradictions. The ideologies of a society reflected its material conditions and served to sustain them. However, material conditions developed to stand in contradiction to the dominant ideology. This was the case during the industrial era, where the foremost contradiction was that of working class and bourgeoisie interests, a conflict resulting in class warfare. As the material conditions of a society force a resolution of its contradictions, the tensions of class struggle inevitably lead to a revolution and an overall transformation of society. For Marxists, this transformation was a foregone conclusion. The culmination of the struggle was determined to result in a final revolution ending all class distinctions. We all know this is exactly what happened, right? Why would you need a communist party if the revolution is inevitably going to happen anyways? Marxists tried to resolve this issue by taking on the role of the historical vanguard, claiming to be more than theorists but the fulfillers of their own scientific destiny. Fate had given them the role of the vital vanguard of the working class. Quoting here from the Communist Manifesto, "The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered, but by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express in general terms actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes." It is clear that none of this came to pass in the way the Marxists had predicted. In the way they became victims of their own dialectic. Their own ideology became the state ideology that is now in contradiction with material conditions, as our economic indicators tell us that the state can no longer effectively run an economy. Hence, in recent history, the excesses of state intervention have been partially reversed by economic policies of deregulation and privatization. Quoting here from Michael Hudson, How Private Banking Replaced Public Money. How do you get rid of a government? You sell it all off to private owners who buy it. Mainly, they borrow the money to buy it. So once you privatize a public utility, you end up sort of like Thames Water in England. You not only add profits and management fees, but you add all the costs of financing debt. So what happened in Thames Water in England is sort of a monster film of what's happened in the United States and other countries. Thames Water buyers kept borrowing money against their right to charge fees for the water and sewer and the protection of England's water. They borrowed the money, but they didn't use this to build better sewers or water pipes. They used it simply to pay dividends to themselves and the dividends and to buy their own stock. Well, that's what happens when you privatize a basic utility. That's what happened throughout the United States. In the 1970s, the governments under Thatcher and Reagan sold off public utilities to the highest bidder and reduced subsidies and taxes on the overall economy. Not only did these measures not lead to any improvement for the economy, but instead they often led to even more inflation and, ironically, more dependence on government welfare. From within the logically consistent framework of libertarian and socialist theories, each side can now blame the failure of these reforms on the other side. Libertarians can claim that the measures did not go far enough and have thus still left us with a light form of socialism, while socialists would say that the failure of the reforms showcases that more capitalism will always make things worse for the average citizen. Despite the large-scale deregulation of the market, it seems the same international elite is in charge of organizations and institutions. The only thing that changed was their mode of operation, as it was no longer sustainable to have the state run entire industries. Hence, those ideologies that supported a liberalization of markets made it into elite policy, whilst other elements of it, like the dismantlement of the welfare state, were ignored. Due to the fallout of mass privatization in the form of unemployment, regular people needed a safety net in order to maintain the relative stability of the system. What does all of this teach us? Power does not care about logical consistency. Our societies cannot be forced into a logical framework from which we can derive all of our policy prescriptions. Our political systems are contradictory. We need to learn to live with it and deal with the contradictory world. The time for all-encompassing political ideologies is over. The working class is gone. The free market is eating our children. Let us find a solution. I'm continuing now with diving deeper into the history of where our modern imperialism comes from and how it has developed. And this whole principle of the contradictory nature of power, of the contradictory free market and state logic that we have. This contradictory nature is a feature, a common feature of power. It is always there. The political dynamic of friend and enemy that Carl Schmitt speaks about is perpetually there in the perpetually revolutionizing of power, in the perpetually circulation of elites and transition of elites throughout history. Beginning here with the Holy Roman Empire, we will then continue with the British and conclude with the current state of empire. You could say the Holy Roman Empire was the first reassertion of a European civilization on the European continent after the decline of the Roman Empire. Let us look at my favorite example for the contradictory nature of power. The Holy Roman Empire. It was never a state in the sense of a centralized system of government, but rather a loose confederation of over 300 duchies and fiefdoms, all formally united under the Roman papacy and a Holy Roman Emperor. The empire's power structure was composed in a very contradictory setup. The Pope was a representative of the kingdom of heaven, where the law of the Lord reigned supreme, and Christ represented eternal life and peace. Now try coercing hundreds of warring Germanic tribes to submit to this teaching. There's not much within Christ's teachings that instruct you on how to deal with the Saxons. Charlemagne, however, knew how to deal with the Saxons and convinced them of Christ's divinity. Quote, by the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxonae, an account of Charlemagne's wars against the Saxons. If any one of the race of the Saxons shall have despised to come to baptism, and shall have wished to remain a pagan, let him be put to death. The Germanic kings that were appointed emperor by the Pope were only able to rule vast territories and subjugate multiple kingdoms because of the legitimacy that was granted to them by the Holy See. At the same time, they were still Germanic kings and would not naturally submit to the whims of some clerical bureaucrat in Rome. Therefore, the emperor would begin to appoint popes that submitted to his authority and supported his political aims. With time, however, the papacy would also gain strength, and a vicious power struggle ensued. Here you can see a famous image of Emperor Heinrich IV and the Pope Gregory VII up there, and their famous struggle known as the Investiturstreit, which was the struggle over who gets to appoint bishops and who gets to decide over church matters. Where the papacy tried to reserve its own sole right in this, and the emperor had a vested interest in having his own influence in that matter. The political system of the Holy Roman Empire was maintained only by the coexistence of papacy and imperial throne, whilst at the same time they were almost perpetually in conflict with each other. At the Council of Constance in 1415, soon-to-be Emperor Sigismund attempted to get the Christian nations of Europe to agree on a new pope, which led the attendant Pope John XXIII to sneak out of the council so he could assemble an army and declare war on Sigismund and the council. The hostility between differing segments within the elite is the primary force justifying continued exertion of power by either side. This contradiction of interests is a feature of political systems, not a bug. At times, the dynamics of state control enable one faction to dominate the other, as when kings would obediently follow the edicts of the Pope under the threat of excommunication. The foremost contradiction in our recent political systems has been the antagonism of formal and informal empire. The former is engaged in what we conventionally understand under conquest and colonization, armies under the banner of some nation showing up in another part of the world in order to take territory. The latter runs on the soft power of international legitimacy, the art of diplomacy, and the strength of a common vision for the future. You could say that The medieval distinction between the worldly power and the church are kind of a distinction between formal and informal power, something that Pareto referred to as lions and foxes, aggressive elites and kind of soft power elites. The belief in Christianity, monastic orders that were mainly dealing in reading and preaching, they were the conduits of that power rather than the warriors. And in many ways, they could outlast the power of the warriors. For the majority of its reign, the British Empire was dominating the planet with its informal empire. The provision of loans for international commerce, the securing of trade routes, and the advocacy for free markets enabled the British to maximally leverage their formal empire. The rapid expansion of their formal empire that involved the conquest of roughly a quarter of our world's landmass happened in the final decades of the empire and should be seen as a sign of late decline. Quote from Robert Morris, a friend of mine, friend of the show. I was on his podcast twice speaking about geopolitics. He was on mine twice, I think. And I can recommend his books, especially his newest one titled Avoiding the British Empire, where he argues that the United States is in the same phase as the late British Empire, where they made a transition from focusing on the informal empire to focusing on the formal empire. And you can see the same transition now with the emergence of figures like Trump that want to move to a more overt and explicit assertion of American power for resources, for strategy, for hemispheric defense and control, rather than diplomatic, idealistic principles like democracy or human rights or women's rights. Quote, "The British shift in focus or general mood, Britain's great mistake, was a shift in emphasis from informal to formal empire. Through the 1850s or so, the policies of the British Empire were more geared towards commercial profit and building informal networks of influence and financial power. After the 1850s, the British became more oriented towards formal empire, the acquisition of vast new territories almost completely free of any commercial logic or economic utility. They undertook this shift in focus in service of misguided notions of imperial prestige and an overestimate of the threat posed by their imperial competitors. By this he means most notably Russia, seen as a kind of portrayed as a kind of Eurasian threat, a dark entity that can overrun civilization like the Mongols did. That was entirely fictitious, that just always represented a paper tiger, you could say. Empires in the modern age tend to create their own enemies or solidify the resolve of already existing ones. Whilst the rise of the British formal empire had fanned the flames of French nationalism, the informal empire facilitated the rise of Imperial Germany. Often the affairs of these rivals and of the colonies would get wound up with Britain's domestic politics. Generally speaking, almost all of foreign policy came to be intertwined with internal politics due to the modern age ushering in an era of global empires. Global empires are no longer territorial, as they no longer have an exterior region beyond what is contained within the confines of the planetary surface area. I would speak of a transformation of geometry. We've transitioned from territorial empires that had an outside, that had a limit, that had a threshold, a border, an outer limit, beyond which there was more land, more territory, always more land to cover and conquer and expand into. This has ended with the first global empire. You could say once the expansion kind of went beyond the globe, the other side of the world, it kind of came back on itself, and there was multiple layers of imperial expansion just overlaying on top of each other and encompassing and enclosing the planet into an imperial network system, into a global system, a one world or new world order, you could say, where every development is internal. It's part of the internal network dynamics of the system, and there is no longer an outside that can be defined territorially speaking. Another quote from Robert Morris: Britain learned earlier that most of that imperial success was not measured in massive territory. What mattered was control of trade and financial power. The loss of the territory that became the United States was painful, but with Britain's growing and more sensible focus on informal empire, it wasn't necessarily even a loss. The US economy grew faster as a free country than it would have as a British territory, and it did so at zero cost to the British in terms of soldiers and administration. In the end, when it came to the scramble for Africa, only a few colonies, such as South Africa, which had already been under British control for a century, were at all profitable. Yet the increasingly hostile trade conditions incentivized the French and the British to take as much land as possible in order to ensure the security of their supply routes. Similarly, the independence of the United States facilitated a much more aggressive expansion of the settler colony into the heart of the American continent. Cotton exports to Britain benefited enormously from the rapid growth of plantations in the American South. The trade partnership between the early United States and Britain remained their most important relationship for many decades. Despite the informal empires supporting a bloody war of independence in 1776, and the formal empire launching a brutal invasion on American soil in 1812, both seemingly contradictory elements of the empire were required for the continued existence of imperial control. Fast forward to our current age, and we can now come to a proper understanding of what the American system is all about. It is driven by the same contradiction between formal and informal empire. As Mencius Moldbug puts it, though some of his categorizations are questionable, quote, anti-Americanism in this interpretation is the organizing ideology of an empire. Call it the Blue Empire, the informal empire. The Blue Empire is an American empire, and its headquarters are in Foggy Bottom, in Cambridge, and Times Square. Anti-Americanists have no idea that they're in fact serving the needs and wishes of the Blue Empire. But then again, why would they? The Blue Empire's bitter enemy is the Red Empire. That is the formal empire. It is, again, it's all internal, right? It's all internal. There's no outside enemy. The enemy of the empire is also within the empire, whose headquarters is in Arlington, and for the moment Pennsylvania Avenue. The Red Empire is currently defending itself in Israel, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Colombia. Former clients such as Chile, Spain, Portugal, South Vietnam, and South Africa have fallen to the blue side. The Red Empire still has strong clients in Asia, though such as Japan, Taiwan, and Indonesia. Meanwhile, a few countries have actually managed to escape the Blue-Red War and became independent. They have names like China and Russia. These places are doing quite well at the moment, although their continuing success is by no means guaranteed. So somehow the empire sustains both. On the one hand, the woke socialists, globalists, or whatever world order of international institutions, and on the other hand, a military-industrial complex engaging in forever wars and covert operations. So, in internet terminology, this is like Global Homo versus Zog, if you follow any of these memes. The UN, World Bank, IMF, WTO, all of them are serving the purposes of running an informal empire of diplomacy and international agreements. Needless to say, this informal empire still serves the interests of the US, but a melting pot US, a US that is open to the entire world and strives to become a multicultural safe haven. The formal empire, on the other hand, opposes globalism of this sort and prefers global dominance, a safety architecture that allows the United States to immediately eliminate every threat anywhere on the globe. These two forces within the empire often appear to be in conflict with each other. Especially Donald Trump has presented himself as an enemy of the deep state, which his supporters identify with the informal globalist empire. Yet he has very clearly become the proponent of the formal empire. The conflict in Palestine is a prime example and symptom of the imperial condition, or imperial contradiction, rather. The informal empire strives to guarantee the emancipation and independence of all oppressed peoples. Hence, it ensures humanitarian support for the Palestinian cause. At the same time, however, the formal empire exerts its control over the Middle East through its relentless military support for the Israeli settler colony. The quibble between two branches of the same empire is currently resulting in masses of children being fed into a meat grinder. What a time to be alive. At the end of the day, it should not be forgotten that both parts of the empire are required for the operation of the political system, and apparent conflicts do not invalidate this fact. For instance, our international rules-based order would require every agent in this system to be equal. But what about bad players? Don't we need the formal empire to remove regimes that may exploit this benign global order? Perhaps it would run more smoothly without Iraq and Iran around, for example. I'm of course not being serious here, this is a hypothetical. Since the end of the Cold War, the empire's foremost conundrum shows itself in full force. After how many illegitimate interventions by the formal empire does the informal empire invalidate itself? A system that runs on legitimacy and prestige cannot at the same time be the most frequent violator of its own international rules. Just like Imperial Germany became a threat of Britain's own making, forcing it to resort to brute military force, the rise of China is becoming an ever more concerning fact for the empire. From the perspective of the United States, it becomes increasingly tempting to deal with rivals using pure military strength, as most of the international prestige of the US is currently being buried under the rubble of Gaza. This has been Colonial Habits and Imperial Vices, my article on Substack, on my Substack titled Notes from the Archive. And I thank you all for listening.